Russian soldiers were once members of an invincible army. They were told they would take Kiev in 3 days, be welcomed with flowers, and rebuild the great Russian Empire. Now, in that fierce and fiery hell in eastern Ukraine, at the Pokrovsk Dobropillia junction, they cling to a single option to survive: to surrender. This is not just the individual choice of a few soldiers, but the most concrete, most human, and most tragic proof of the moral and physical collapse of an army, the failure of Putin's entire war machine. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy announced that in 2025, on this critical eastern front alone, in the Dobropillia, Pokrovsk direction, approximately 2,200 Russian soldiers were captured or surrendered. That is 2,200 lives, the same number of families and young men. They lost their chances for Putin's imperial dreams, but chose to save their lives thanks to Ukraine's mercy. This figure is only a small part of the enormous disaster Russia is experiencing. This is just the frozen tip of the iceberg. Beneath the surface lies a total loss of over 1 million dead and wounded, shattered regiments, depleted tank inventories in depots, and an unstoppable hemorrhage that claims 1,060 more soldiers every day. This is no longer a war. It is an irreversible annihilation operation that Putin is waging against his own army. Within this annihilation operation, what this wave of prisoners in Pokrovsk tells us, and why these soldiers chose to surrender rather than die, are among the most pressing questions. And how this mass collapse will lead Putin's final offensive plans into disaster in the approaching winter season is another of these questions. So now is the time to shed light on all the unknown questions. Putin's entire strategy for the summer and fall of 2025 was built on one word: Pokrovsk. This is the last major industrial and logistics center in the Donetsk Oblast under Ukrainian control. The fall of this city would give Russia not only a psychological victory, but also a strategic key to its goal of seizing the entire Donbass. That is why the Kremlin threw its last remaining combat power, tens of thousands of soldiers and hundreds of armored vehicles, into this narrow front line, like a war machine. However, facing them was a Ukrainian army that had been waiting for this moment for months, equipped with Western weapons and skilled in the doctrine of elastic defense. As the Russian army attempted to advance in waves, it was mercilessly hunted down by Ukraine's FPV drones, precision artillery batteries, German PZH-2000s, Swedish archers, and javelin teams lying in ambush. As confirmed by independent international sources, Russia's attempts to approach this important city were met with fierce Ukrainian resistance and turned into a grueling war of attrition. The numbers leave no room to hide the scale of this defeat. Daily reports from the Ukrainian General Staff show that losses on this front have now reached an irreparable level. As mentioned in the introduction to the video, the neutralization of 1,060 more Russian soldiers in the last 24 hours alone has brought the total military personnel losses to over 1,114,000 as of October 28, 2025. This is not just a statistic. It means that an entire fully equipped battalion is being wiped out every day. And these heavy figures represent not only human loss, but also a material catastrophe. Reports published in recent days show that even the massive stockpiles of armored vehicles from the Soviet era are almost depleted. In warehouses that once held more than 7,000 tanks, there may now be only 92 rusted, useless wrecks left. Ukraine has destroyed more than 50% of Russia's armored vehicle and artillery stockpiles. On the Pokrovsk front, Russia's weekly tank and armored vehicle losses sometimes exceed the monthly production capacity of its own factories. This is a mathematically unsustainable war, and in the midst of this hell, the ordinary Russian soldier in the trenches faces the simplest and most brutal choice of his life. In front of him lie Ukraine's machine guns and FPV drones. Behind him are his own commanders' blocking units, ready to shoot him if he retreats. If he stays in the trench, he will wait for death from starvation, disease, or the next artillery shell. And at that very moment, he hears the whisper of a fourth option from a small radio in his pocket or a brochure. I want to live, or Hochu Jit. This is one of the most successful psychological operations conducted by Ukraine during the war. This program offers Russian soldiers a simple and safe way to surrender. Through a secure phone line, a telegram bot, or a radio frequency, soldiers who wish to surrender are given instructions on how and where to safely reach Ukrainian lines. And what this program offers is much more than the meaningless death Putin offers them. Ukraine promises these soldiers full legal protection under the Geneva Conventions, medical care, 3 hot meals a day, and most importantly, dignity. Contrary to Moscow's propaganda, these soldiers are not tortured or humiliated. On the contrary, they are seen as victims of Putin's regime. Therefore, the figure of 2,200 announced by Zelenskyy is not just the number of prisoners of war, but also proof of the belief in and desperation for this program. The fact that more than 13,800 Russian soldiers, registered by name and unit number in the I Want to Live project's database, are waiting to surrender shows how deep this collapse is. For these soldiers, surrendering is not cowardice or treason, but the most rational, logical, and humane decision made in the midst of madness. They have chosen to live rather than die for Putin's imperial dreams. This situation has turned into an unsolvable crisis for Russian commanders. It is unclear how they will keep their soldiers' morale high, how to dissuade them from believing that Ukraine's mercy is better than their own commander's cruelty is also a critical issue for Russian commanders. So what is the Kremlin doing in the face of this wave of mass surrender and desertion? The answer is to increase pressure, oppression, and lies. Russia's first move in this regard is to impose severe penalties and sanctions to prevent desertion. The families of those who flee are threatened, and those who are caught are thrown into torture pits called dungeons or executed, as we have noted in our previous analyses. However, the most ruthless and unethical tactics are being used against soldiers who return through prisoner exchanges. When Ukraine returns these prisoners to Russia in accordance with the Geneva Conventions, it hopes that these soldiers will not fight again. However, as documented by Ukrainian authorities and human rights organizations, Russia brands these returning prisoners of war as traitors instead of sending them home for rehabilitation or rest. And they are sent back to the front lines within just a few weeks to atone for their betrayal. For Russian soldiers, this means escaping hell only to be thrown back into the same hell. This situation sends a diabolical message. The price of surrendering to Ukraine is being condemned by one's own state to an even worse death. So does this harsh stance reduce desertions, or does it increase them? Paradoxically, the answer is that it increases desertion even more, because a Russian soldier now knows this. If he is taken prisoner in Ukraine, he has a chance of survival and humane treatment. But if he returns to Russia, he will either be branded a traitor or sent back to the front lines to an inevitable death. This equation makes the I Want to Live program much more appealing, not just as an option to surrender, but also as a permanent path to salvation. Despite the increase in applications to I Want to Live in the face of over 1 million casualties, more than 70,000 deserters, and 2,200 new prisoners, Putin's order to take Pokrovsk by mid-November remains on the agenda. This order is more of a propaganda show than a military strategy. Without compensating for these losses, the Russian army will struggle to capture even a small position, let alone Pokrovsk. The possibility of Russia launching a new wave of mass mobilization is one of the most feared issues. This is also the greatest fear of the Moscow regime, because this situation means bringing the war into the homes of the middle class in Moscow and St. Petersburg in a way they can no longer ignore. Instead, the Kremlin is resorting to a much more insidious method: ghost mobilization and forced conscription. Russia is forcibly conscripting hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian citizens in the Ukrainian territories it has occupied, namely Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, Kherson, and Crimea, to fight against their own country. This is a war crime under international law. Furthermore, this situation shows that Putin is using not only his own ethnic minorities or prisoners, but also the people he has invaded as pawns for his own army. And the most ironic, and for Putin the most dangerous, part of this story is that not all of these deserting and captured soldiers are quietly waiting in prisoner camps. Some of the soldiers who have deserted or surrendered from the Russian army are agreeing to fight alongside Ukraine. The number of these volunteer units, made up of Russian citizens themselves, themselves, such as the Legion of Freedom of Russia and the Siberian Battalion, has seen a significant increase in recent months, parallel to this collapse on the front lines. As this wave of desertions continues, the accumulation in these legions will inevitably increase. This means that Putin has not only lost more than 1 million soldiers, but has also created thousands of new enemies from his own blood, who speak his language, know his tactics, and most importantly, hate him. These legions play a key role in Ukraine's operations to bring the war onto Russia's own territory, particularly in places like Belgorod and Kursk. Ultimately, what is happening on the Pokrovsk front is not just a military advance. It is a snapshot of a moral and psychological collapse. The approaching winter season is setting the stage not for Putin's new offensive plan, but for the total collapse of his army. An army without fuel, without equipment, and most importantly, without the will to fight, cannot survive against General Winter. Putin will lose this winter, because Russian soldiers are now choosing the life promised by Ukraine over dying for his lies. However, the catastrophe created by this ghost army and those angry legionnaires joining the Ukrainian ranks is not limited to the military vacuum it creates on the front lines or the political threat it poses. The real destruction, which may be irreparable for decades, lies much deeper in Russia's own social fabric, national spirit, and economic future. Putin's war has turned into a ruthless demographic operation that is consuming not only today's army, but also tomorrow's Russia. This bleeding at the front is the beginning of an irreversible national catastrophe that is turning Russia into a hollowed-out, rotten camel from within. To understand this strategic catastrophe, we must grasp that the total losses and desertion figures are not merely military statistics, but economic and demographic black holes. War sifts through a nation's most valuable, productive, and dynamic asset, its male population aged 20 to 40, as if through a sieve. And Russia entered this war already in the grip of a horrific demographic crisis. Russia, struggling with an aging population, did not have a sacrificial young generation to send to Ukraine. By starting this war, Putin has essentially sent his nation's last drop of blood to the front lines. This collapse of human capital has two immediate and devastating effects on the war machine. The first is the death of the professional army and the loss of experience. Those who died in the first year of the war were not just raw recruits. They were Russia's best VDV airborne commandos, Spetsnaz special forces operators, experienced tank commanders, and most importantly, the backbone of an army, namely the non-commissioned officers and junior officers. These people cannot be replaced in 6 months with a mobilization order. The experience of a non-commissioned officer or a captain is gained through years of training and field practice. Russia completely depleted this pool of experience in those senseless waves of attacks on Kiev and Kharkiv. Now, a significant portion of the desertions in the Russian army consists of the few remaining experienced personnel fleeing this pressure. So, what is the result? The Russian army on the front lines has become a body that has lost its brain. Units are now often commanded by rookie lieutenants who have been given emergency promotions, have zero experience, and can only shout the order to advance to the death. This is the clearest explanation of why they collapsed like a house of cards on a complex front like Pokrovsk, facing Ukraine's NATO-style, flexible, and initiative-taking units. There is no longer a command structure in the Russian army capable of organizing even a tactical retreat or maintaining discipline. Alongside this military hemorrhage, there is another, equally devastating civilian hemorrhage: the relocanti crisis, or the Great Escape. Since Putin's disastrous mobilization declaration in September 2022, over 1 million Russian citizens, mostly young, educated, urban, and most importantly male, have fled the country. They have sought refuge in Georgia, Armenia, Kazakhstan, and Turkey to avoid dying for Putin's war. This brain drain, combined with the blood drain at the front, creates a perfect storm for Russia. These two groups are Russia's most productive demographic pool. They are not just the soldiers on the front lines. They are also the programmers who will run the software companies in Moscow, the surgeons who will work in the hospitals in St. Petersburg, and most importantly, the engineers and skilled workers who will run the factories that need to feed Putin's war machine. As can be seen, in order to win the war in Ukraine, Putin has been forced to consume that last skilled workforce that keeps his industry and economy afloat. Russia now struggles not only to find the steel or chips to produce tanks, but also to find the people to press the button on that production line, to operate that machine. This is not a supply chain crisis. This is a human crisis. Faced with this internal human resource collapse, the Kremlin has only two solutions left, both of which are ruthless and unsustainable. Solution 1 is imported legionnaires, namely North Korea and beyond. If you cannot send your own citizens to war, you import the poorest and most desperate citizens of other countries. The 20,000 North Korean soldiers deployed to the Ukrainian border, which we mentioned in our previous analyses, are the clearest example of this strategy. This is not limited to North Korea. Russia is sending thousands of young people from Nepal, India, Somalia, and even Cuba to the front lines as mercenaries, lured by promises of high salaries and Russian citizenship. However, this is not an army, but a Tower of Babel. These units cannot speak Russian, do not know the terrain, and cannot establish a bond with Russian commanders. Their motivation is zero, and at the first opportunity they either desert, further increasing the number of deserters to 70,000, or take refuge in Ukraine's "I want to live" line. These imported soldiers increase not the strength of the Russian army, but its moral bankruptcy and helplessness. Solution 2 is the prisoner armies, or Storm Z. Putin's second and main source of confidence is his own prisons. Prigozhin's strategy of recruiting prisoners into the army has now become official state policy. These penal battalions, called Storm Z, consist of tens of thousands of prisoners convicted of the most serious crimes. However, this also brings chaos, not discipline, to the front lines. These men fight not for their country, but for amnesty and money. They do not listen to their own commanders. Their desertion rates are astronomical, and most importantly, they commit horrific crimes against civilians and even their own regular army units. Behind the front lines, there are countless reports of bloody clashes between these Storm Z units and regular army units or ethnic battalions, such as Kadyrov's men, over resources, food, and even weapons. The Russian army is now fighting not only against Ukraine but also within itself, against these different factions of warlords. As a result, the 2,200 prisoners in Pokrovsk and the tens of thousands of deserters at the front are not just a military loss. They are symptoms of a much larger disease, namely Russia's demographic and industrial demise. In setting out to conquer Ukraine, Putin has sacrificed a future generation of his own nation. As this winter season sets in, the Russian army is losing not only on frozen ground, but also in emptying factories, abandoned cities, and most crucially, in the minds of its demoralized soldiers who are asking why they are dying. This is an irreparable strategic collapse. For Ukraine to win, perhaps no more major offensives will be needed. Perhaps victory will come simply by waiting, by silently watching the Russian bear collapse from its own blood loss, from its own human resource bankruptcy. Thank you for watching.